The body was frozen solid when Sheriff Ethan Cole found it. One bullet, one hole, clean through the sternum from a distance nobody in Silver Hollow, Montana could even measure with the equipment they had. Then a second body turned up 20 minutes later. Same wound, same impossible angle. Nobody in town could explain it. Except the quiet woman on the ridge. The one retired Commander Grant Holloway had publicly mocked 3 days earlier for thinking she belonged anywhere near a firearm. She hadn't said a word when he laughed at her. She didn't need to. If this story already has you leaning forward, good. Hit that like button right now. Subscribe so you never miss what comes next. And drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Let's go. The first thing Ethan Cole noticed was the silence. Not the ordinary quiet of a Montana winter morning where the cold just pressed down on everything and made the world feel smaller. This was different. This was the particular silence that settles over a place after something violent has happened. A held breath kind of stillness, like the trees themselves were keeping their mouths shut. He'd driven 40 minutes up a logging road that hadn't been properly maintained since the previous spring, his department truck sliding twice on black ice he almost didn't see in time, and when he finally reached the coordinates Deputy Marlene Oakes had radioed in, he stepped out into 8 inches of fresh snow and stood there for a moment just listening. Nothing. Not a bird, not wind, just the distant creak of pine branches weighted down with ice. "Over here," Marlene called. She was standing near a cluster of spruce trees about 30 yards off the road, her breath coming out in thick clouds, her face doing the thing it did when she was trying not to show she was rattled. Marlene Oakes had been a deputy for 11 years. She didn't rattle easily. Ethan pulled his collar up and walked toward her. The man was on his back in the snow. Mid-40s, maybe. Heavy gear, layered thermal base, tactical pants, decent boots. The kind of kit that didn't come cheap. His gloved hands were still curled slightly, like he'd been reaching for something when he went down, and the snow around his upper chest was stained dark in a radius that told Ethan the man had been standing when it happened. The blood pattern was too spread out for a prone position. He'd been upright. He'd dropped straight back. Ethan crouched and studied the wound without touching anything. Small entry point, tight. The jacket fabric around the hole had barely torn, which meant high velocity, tight grouping, a bullet that had carried enough energy to punch clean without tumbling. He'd seen enough gunshot wounds in 15 years of law enforcement to read what he was looking at. "Rifle shot," he said. "That's what I figured." Marlene pointed northeast. "He's facing that way. Exit wounds bigger, came out the back. Whatever hit him came from somewhere up that slope." Ethan stood and looked up the mountain. The tree line broke about 800 yards out, giving way to a long exposed ridge line before the terrain climbed again into rock and deep timber. The ridge was probably 1,000, maybe 1,100 yards from where the man had fallen. He didn't say what he was thinking. He just took out his phone, called it in, and asked for the county coroner. "There's something else," Marlene said. He looked at her. "I almost didn't find him because I was already looking at the other one." The second body was another quarter-mile up the logging road, tucked into a shallow drainage ditch on the east side. Same profile. Heavy tactical gear, no identification, no vehicle nearby. Same wound. Ethan stood over him and felt something cold move through him that had nothing to do with the temperature. One shot like that was remarkable. 2 was a message. "Same shooter?" Marlene asked. "Unless you think 2 different people with the same impossible skill set happened to be working this mountain on the same morning, yeah," Ethan said. "Same shooter." "From where?" "I don't know yet." He did know one thing, though. Whoever had made these shots hadn't been in a hurry. There was no physical evidence of movement around either body. No secondary tracks, no shell casings anywhere nearby. No sign that whoever fired had ever come to check their work. They had simply shot from somewhere far away, twice, with what appeared to be near-perfect effect, and then vanished back into the mountain like they'd never existed. The trail they found, a single set of boot prints in the deep snow heading up toward the ridge, was almost incidental. Like whoever made it wasn't trying to hide and wasn't particularly concerned about being followed. Ethan followed the prints for 3 hours with Marlene and a county deputy named Shrike, who'd driven up from Clearwater. The tracks climbed the ridge in a deliberate, unhurried line. Whoever had made them moved with purpose, not panic. No slipping, no doubling back, no signs of rushing. The stride was even and measured even on terrain that had Ethan grabbing at tree branches for balance. The tracks ended at a cabin. It sat on a natural shelf in the rock about 2/3 up the eastern face, a modest structure, timber-framed, with a metal roof that had shed its snow load cleanly. Firewood was stacked in tight, organized rows under an overhang on the south wall. A small satellite dish was mounted near the peak of the roof. A motion sensor light above the door was currently off in the daylight. Whoever lived here had set this place up with care and intention. The woman was standing outside when they arrived. She was holding a cup of something hot, coffee, probably. And she didn't look surprised to see 3 armed law enforcement officers working their way up the last stretch of slope toward her. She watched them come with the kind of stillness that Ethan associated with people who'd spent a lot of time in situations where moving suddenly was a liability. She was younger than he'd expected, late 20s, maybe 30 at most, medium height, lean in a functional rather than delicate way, the kind of build that came from years of physical work rather than a gym. Her hair was dark and pulled back practically. She had a scar along her left jawline that was old and well-healed, maybe 4 inches long, the kind that came from something that had happened fast and close. Her eyes were what stopped him, though, gray-green and very steady. Not nervous, not hostile, just watching, measuring. The rifle was leaning against the cabin wall to her right, a long gun, bolt action, with a serious optic mounted on top. Even from 20 feet away, Ethan could see it was not a hunting setup. "Lena Voss?" he said. "That's right." Her voice was even, no performance in it. "Sheriff Ethan Cole, Silver Hollow PD." He stopped about 10 feet from her. "We found 2 men on the logging road below your property, both deceased." She looked at him steadily. "I know." Marlene's hand drifted toward her holster. "You know," Ethan repeated. "I called it in," Lena said, "about 4 hours ago. Didn't your dispatch tell you?" He looked at Marlene. Marlene looked back at him with an expression that said, "I'm going to have a serious conversation with someone when we get back to the office." Lena set her cup down on a rough wooden table near the door. "You want to come inside and I can walk you through it? Or you want to do this out here in the cold?" The inside of the cabin was spare and orderly. A wood stove in the corner ran hot, taking the edge off the mountain air that pushed in when the door opened. A folding table against the far wall held 2 laptop computers, a radio setup, and several hard drives in a rack. Topographic maps covered one entire wall, annotated in small, precise handwriting. A narrow cot was made with military tightness. The kitchen area, if you could call it that, was 4 feet of counter, a propane burner, and a shelf of functional supplies. Ethan had been in the cabins of a lot of mountain people over the years. Most of them had a particular quality of clutter. Accumulated life, accumulated things. This place had none of that. It felt operational rather than lived in. Lena sat across from him at the small table and explained what had happened in the same careful, sequential way that people who'd had formal briefing training tend to explain things. No drama, no embellishment. She'd been up at 0330 for reasons of her own when her perimeter alert had triggered. Cameras she'd installed on her property lines, she showed him the feeds on the laptop, professional-grade equipment, had picked up 2 individuals moving through her land in the dark. Not for the first time. "How long has this been going on?" Ethan asked. "About 3 weeks. Different people each time. 2, 3 at a time, moving through the same general corridor heading up mountain." She pulled up a map on one of the laptops and traced the route with a fingertip. "They're not hunters. Their movement patterns are wrong for that. Too deliberate. They're using bearing and pace navigation, not following game signs. And they carry the wrong gear." "What kind of gear?" "Military surplus, mostly. Some of it newer. Comms equipment." She paused. "Last week, one of them had a ground-penetrating radar unit, portable, the kind you use for subsurface surveying." Shrike, standing near the door, made a quiet sound. Ethan kept his face neutral. "And this morning?" "This morning, those 2 came onto my property with weapons drawn and moved directly toward the cabin." She said it simply, like she was describing weather. "I was already in position on the ridge. When the first one raised his weapon toward the structure, I stopped him. When the second attempted to flank and set up a firing position, I stopped him too. From the ridge. Yes, that's... Shrike started and then stopped himself. About 940 yards to the first target, Lena said. The second was closer. Maybe 810. Silence in the cabin. Ethan looked at the woman across from him. She was watching him with those steady gray-green eyes, not offering anything more than what he'd asked for, not performing calm either. She just was calm, in a way that didn't quite fit any frame he had for a 29-year-old woman living alone on a Montana mountain. "You were in the military," he said. Not a question. "Army, 8 years." She didn't elaborate. "What unit?" A pause that was just long enough to be deliberate. "I'm not in a position to discuss that specifically." He sat with that for a moment. "All right. We're going to need to take your rifle. I know, I've already field stripped and photographed it per protocol. The documentation's on the thumb drive on top of the red hard drive." She nodded toward the table. "Chain of custody starts with you." Marlene caught Ethan's eye from across the room. Her expression had shifted. She wasn't rattled anymore. She was impressed, and trying not to show that either. They didn't arrest her. They couldn't, not right away. The bodies had been on her property. The men had been armed, and she'd called it in herself before law enforcement even knew there was anything to respond to. The legal picture was complex, and Ethan knew it would take time he didn't have to sort out. What he did was drive back down the mountain with 2 dead men in county bags, a confiscated rifle that would go to the state lab, and a very specific question lodged in the back of his skull that he couldn't stop turning over. Who was Lena Voss, actually? The question wasn't rhetorical. He ran her name as soon as he got back to the office. What he found was mostly empty space, the kind of carefully managed absence that meant something rather than nothing. An Army enlistment record. A general discharge under honorable conditions. A residential address in Silver Hollow going back about 8 months, prior to which she'd apparently lived nowhere at all, that left a paper trail. No criminal record, no traffic violations, no credit history to speak of. She existed on paper the way people exist on paper when someone has been deliberate about making sure they don't. Marlene stood in his doorway while he read. "You know Grant Holloway's going to call," she said. Ethan rubbed his eyes. "I know. He's already left 2 messages." "I know." Grant Holloway was 63 years old, a retired Army lieutenant colonel, and the closest thing Silver Hollow had to a local celebrity. He'd done 2 combat tours in the 90s, come home decorated, and spent the last 2 decades being the town's most enthusiastic version of itself, on the volunteer fire board, on the city council, at every public function, always with something to say. He was genuinely respected by most people, genuinely liked by many, and he had an instinct for inserting himself into situations that he'd refined to an art form. Ethan had met him 6 months ago when he'd first taken the sheriff's job. Holloway had shaken his hand firmly, looked him in the eye, and said, "I'm always available if you need historical context on anything around here." The offer had sounded helpful at the time. Ethan was already starting to understand what it actually meant. He called Holloway back. "2 dead men on my mountain," Holloway said, before Ethan had finished introducing himself. "That's what I'm hearing. Is that accurate?" "We have 2 deceased individuals we're investigating. I can't share details of an active and the woman up there, Voss." "She's involved?" Ethan kept his voice measured. "Like I said, I can't. I'm going to tell you something, Sheriff, and I'm saying this as someone who's lived in this county his whole life." Holloway's voice had the cadence of a man accustomed to being listened to. "That woman moved up here 8 months ago and has not engaged with this community in any meaningful way. She doesn't come to town meetings. She doesn't, Mr. Holloway. I'm just saying I've made it my business to know who's on that mountain, and I'll tell you right now that a woman, alone, whatever her Army record says, is not equipped to be operating independently up there. It's not a question of..." "I appreciate your input," Ethan said, and ended the call. He sat for a moment. Then he went back to Lena Voss's file. 10. 3 days earlier, before any of this had happened, Silver Hollow had held its annual Winter Veterans Appreciation Dinner at the community center on Birch Street. It was a small-town affair, potluck dishes on folding tables, paper streamers in red, white, and blue, a slideshow that ran on a loop near the door. About 90 people, maybe. Ethan had attended in his official capacity and spent most of the evening near the coffee urn trying to look approachable. Grant Holloway had given a speech. He talked about sacrifice, about tradition, about what it meant to truly earn the title of warrior. It was a good speech in many of the ways that mattered: sincere, well-structured, drawing on real experience. The room had listened respectfully. And then someone in the back, Ethan hadn't seen who, had asked about the growing number of women in combat roles. Whether Holloway thought that changed things, whether he'd served alongside women. Holloway had taken a breath and answered with the confidence of a man who had never once been wrong about anything in his own accounting. "I have tremendous respect for the women who serve," he'd said. Tremendous. But there's a reason certain roles exist the way they do. Combat is not a space that can be made equal by policy. Biology doesn't negotiate. I've seen what it takes to be a true warrior, and I've never seen a woman who could... He'd paused then, and Ethan had noticed him looking toward the back of the room. Lena Voss was standing near the door with a paper cup of coffee in her hand, looking at nothing in particular. She'd apparently slipped in sometime during the speech. Ethan hadn't noticed her arrive. She was in civilian clothes, hair down, nothing to distinguish her except that stillness she always seemed to carry. She didn't react to the pause. She didn't look at Holloway. She just stood there. "I've never seen a woman," Holloway had continued, recovering smoothly, "who didn't face unique challenges in that environment. The ones who serve deserve our support precisely because it's harder for them." The room had clapped. A few people had looked at Lena. One or two had smirked. Lena had finished her coffee, set the cup in the trash, and walked out without saying anything. Ethan had watched her go and thought, that woman has a story she's not telling. He hadn't known how right he was. Yeah. The state forensics lab called the next morning with preliminary ballistics on the 2 recovered rounds. The technician, a methodical man named Driscoll, who had no particular gift for drama, delivered the information in a flat professional monotone that somehow made it land harder. Both rounds are consistent with .338 Lapua Magnum. Match on the rifling to the weapon you submitted. High probability pending full analysis. A pause. Shot 1. Distance estimate based on deformation and trajectory data is 920 to 960 yards. Shot 2, approximately 800 yards. Both shots achieved near identical terminal effect. Another pause, slightly longer. "Deputy, I've been doing this work for 22 years. "Sheriff," Ethan said. "Sheriff, I've processed thousands of ballistic cases. I'm going to tell you off the record that these 2 shots, at that distance, under those conditions, with that consistency, whoever made them is operating at a level I associate with military or federal long-range precision training. Not civilian, not hunting, precision, the kind you get from serious, sustained institutional development." Ethan thanked him and sat with that for a while. 920 yards. In winter mountain conditions, with wind variables he didn't even know how to calculate, and she'd described it afterward with the same effect she'd used to describe where she kept her thumb drive. He looked up from his desk. Marlene was standing in the doorway again. "The state investigator's here," she said, "and Holloway's in the parking lot." "Of course he is." "He brought coffee." "Tell him I'm busy." Marlene almost smiled. "He also brought the mayor." Ethan closed his laptop, stood up, straightened his jacket. This was about to become something bigger than 2 bodies on a logging road and one very quiet woman who could shoot from the edge of the possible. He could feel it. The way you feel a storm front before the pressure actually drops. Not seeing it yet, just knowing it's there, building behind the tree line, already committed to arriving. Oh, the state investigator's name was Tesler. She was 40, sharp-eyed, and clearly hadn't slept on the drive up from Helena. She shook Ethan's hand and immediately asked to see the site maps, the cam footage Lena had provided, and the preliminary ballistics. Holloway managed to intercept Ethan in the hallway before the meeting started. "Grant!" Ethan kept moving. 2 minutes. Holloway fell into step beside him. He was a big man, well-maintained, with the posture of someone who'd been correcting younger people's posture for decades. "I'm not here to interfere. I just want to make sure you understand what you're dealing with. Enlighten me. That woman, Voss, I know her type. I've seen it. Comes back from wherever she was, doesn't reintegrate, stays isolated, builds up a paranoid fortress mentality. What happened up there was not some heroic defensive action. It was 2 armed men entered her property with weapons ready, Ethan said. At least one of them had a firearm raised toward an occupied structure. That's her account. It's also consistent with the physical evidence. Ethan stopped and turned to face him. Grant, with respect, I appreciate your experience and your investment in this community, but this is an active investigation, and I need to work it without, he searched for the word, input from people who weren't there. Holloway's jaw tightened slightly, not used to being redirected. I'm just saying she's not who you think she is. I think she's someone I don't have nearly enough information about yet, Ethan said, which is exactly why I'm going to keep working the case instead of standing in a hallway. He walked into the conference room and closed the door. The meeting with Tesler lasted 3 hours. What emerged from it was a picture that went a lot further than 2 dead men in the snow. The deceased had been identified through fingerprints. Both had criminal records, not local, not Montana. One had a prior federal charge for trafficking in controlled military equipment that had been plea bargained down years ago. The other had done 18 months for conspiracy charges related to a theft from a National Guard armory in Idaho. These are not random, Tesler said, spreading the files across the table. These 2 were specialists. They were hired for a specific purpose by someone with resources and direction. Hired to do what? Marlene asked. That's what we don't know yet. Tesler tapped the topographic map Lena had provided. But the movement corridor they were using, and apparently have been using for 3 weeks, leads to this sector of the mountain. She circled a section of elevated terrain northeast of Lena's cabin, which is, according to old USGS surveys, the location of several underground structures built during a federal infrastructure project in the early 1960s. The room went quiet. What kind of structures? Ethan said. Tesler looked at him carefully. The kind that don't show up in public records, she said. The kind that require a federal clearance to even acknowledge the existence of. Ethan sat back. He thought about the ground-penetrating radar Lena had mentioned, the tactical formations, the bearing and pace navigation. They weren't hunting, they were searching. And whatever they were searching for had been buried for 60 years under that mountain, and apparently someone had recently figured out where. He thought about Lena Voss, alone in her cabin with her cameras and her maps and her .338, watching these people move through her land for 3 weeks, calling no one, saying nothing publicly, just watching and waiting with that particular stillness she carried. She already knew, he realized. She hadn't just stumbled into a defensive situation that morning. She'd been tracking this for weeks. She'd been building a picture. And this morning, when those men had come with weapons ready, she hadn't panicked or hesitated. She'd simply done what she'd apparently been trained to do. The question now wasn't whether Lena Voss was capable. The question, the one that had been sitting in the back of his skull since he'd stood over that first body in the snow, was what exactly she'd been trained to do and who had trained her, and why she was sitting on a Montana mountain with a precision rifle and satellite data and operational maps watching a 60-year-old Cold War secret get excavated by hired criminals. Ethan's phone buzzed. He looked down at it. Unknown number. Montana area code, but not one he recognized. He answered it. Sheriff Cole. The voice was low and precise. Female. He'd heard it once that morning across a small table in a timber-framed cabin with military-tight bed corners. I think we need to talk again. Not at the station. Ms. Voss, there's something up there that those men were looking for, and I know what it is. A pause. Brief. Controlled. And I know why it can't leave that mountain. Outside the conference room window, the afternoon light was already failing over the ridge line, the sky going the particular gray-purple of a Montana winter evening, dropping early and fast. Ethan looked at the map spread across the table, at the circled section of terrain, at the notation underground structures, federal, pre-1965. Where do you want to meet? He said. There's a pull-off on the east fork of Route 9, mile marker 14. Tonight. Come alone. The line went dead. Marlene was watching him from across the table. So was Tesler. Well, Marlene said quietly, that doesn't sound like a woman who doesn't know what she's doing. No, Ethan thought, it did not. He folded the map carefully, tucked it inside his jacket, and reached for his coat. Whatever was buried under that mountain had been waiting 60 years for someone to come looking. And now, apparently, They had. The question was whether the wrong people were going to get there first, and the only person who seemed to actually know the answer to that was a 29-year-old woman the town had laughed at 3 days ago for daring to show up in the same room as their war heroes. Ethan walked out into the cold, and the mountain waited above him in the dark, holding every one of its secrets tight. Mile marker 14 on the east fork of Route 9 was not a place anyone drove to on purpose. The pull-off was a gravel wedge cut into the hillside where the road bent sharply west, barely wide enough for 2 vehicles if they parked tight. In summer, it probably caught the occasional hiker checking a map. In January, in the dark, at 18 degrees Fahrenheit, it was just a cold piece of nowhere with a guardrail and a long drop into black timber on the other side. Ethan pulled in at 8:47 and sat with the engine running. His headlights caught the guardrail, a section of frost-silvered gravel and nothing else. He waited. The heater fan was loud in the silence of the cab. At 8:51, a figure stepped out of the tree line on the uphill side of the road. Lena Voss crossed the gravel without hurrying and knocked twice on the passenger window. Ethan unlocked the door and she got in, bringing cold air and the smell of pine resin with her. She was dressed in dark layers, a wool cap pulled down, a pack on one shoulder that she set between her feet on the floorboard. She didn't say hello. "You found my call trace yet?" she said. "Burner phone," Ethan said. Obviously. Obviously. She looked straight ahead through the windshield at the guardrail. "I need to know something before I tell you anything. Are you recording this?" "No." She turned and looked at him directly. Whatever she was reading in his face apparently satisfied her because she looked away again. "Okay. That's it? You just take my word?" "I took your word that you'd come alone." "You did." A pause. People who lie about the small things usually lie about them in ways you can catch. You haven't. Ethan turned the heater down a notch so he could hear better. "What do you know about what's under that mountain?" Lena reached into the pack and pulled out a folded piece of paper, a printed topographic overlay with hand annotations in that same small, precise handwriting he'd seen in the cabin. She spread it across her knees. "Project Carver," she said. "That's the designation. 1961 through 1968. It was a federal program, technically Defense Department. Practically speaking, it operated outside normal DoD channels. The official purpose was establishing hardened underground storage for emergency communications equipment in remote mountainous terrain. The actual purpose was," she paused, choosing her word, "broader than that." "Broader how?" "They stored things that weren't supposed to exist." She tapped a marked location on the map. 3 structures under this mountain. 2 of them were decommissioned and sealed in 1972. The third one, another tap, was supposed to be cleared and sealed in 1974. According to the paperwork, it was. But it wasn't. It wasn't. She folded the map along a crease with the automatic precision of someone who'd done it 1,000 times. The materials that were supposed to be removed and destroyed were instead sealed in place. Someone decided it was easier to bury the problem than solve it. Ethan sat with that for a moment. What kind of materials? Lena looked at him. The truck cab was dim, the only light coming from the instrument panel and the faint ambient glow through the windshield. And in that half-light, her expression was difficult to read. Careful, he thought. Not guarded in the way of someone hiding something personal, guarded in the way of someone managing information that had weight to it. "The kind that don't degrade cleanly," she said. "The kind that, if someone with the wrong intentions recovers them and moves them off that mountain without proper containment protocol, become a serious problem for a significant number of people. You're telling me there are weapons up there?" "I'm telling you there are materials up there that in the wrong configuration and the wrong hands could be weaponized." "Yes." She said it flat. No drama. "The men who've been moving through this corridor for the past 3 weeks are not explorers. They know exactly what they're looking for, and they have the technical knowledge to handle it. Whoever hired them has both the money to fund a 3-week extraction operation in January in Montana and the connections to sell what they recover." Ethan stared at the guardrail through the windshield. He'd driven up here expecting something complicated. He hadn't expected this. "How do you know all of this?" A pause that lasted several seconds. Outside, the wind moved through the pines and settled again. I spent 3 years attached to a unit that spent a lot of time worrying about exactly this category of problem, Lena said. Cold War-era materials improperly secured or decommissioned, locations that got lost in bureaucratic transitions, sites that exist in files that don't get opened because the people who knew about them are dead or retired or keeping quiet for reasons of their own. She looked at the map in her hands. When I moved here, I didn't know about Carver. I moved here because I wanted to be somewhere quiet and high and away from people. But you found out. I found a reference in county land survey records from 1963, a right-of-way notation that didn't match anything on the public maps. I pulled the thread. She glanced at him. I've been trying to figure out the right way to report it for 4 months. The problem is that reporting it through normal channels means the information passes through a lot of hands before it reaches anyone with the clearance and the will to actually do something. And every hand it passes through is a potential leak. And someone already found the leak, Ethan said. Yes. He exhaled slowly. The heater was loud. He reached over and turned it off entirely, and the silence that replaced it felt more honest. Why come to me now? Because this morning escalated things past where I can manage them alone. A note of something in her voice, not quite frustration, not quite admission, the sound of someone who'd been running a solo operation and was now acknowledging its limits. They sent 2 people onto my property with weapons because they've identified me as a potential interference. That means they're either close to completing the extraction or they're being pushed by a deadline from whoever's buying. Either way, I'm out of time. You've been sitting on this for months and now you're out of time. Yes. A beat. I know how that sounds. It sounds like you've been running a one-person surveillance operation on a federal site involving dangerous materials while living in a cabin alone on a mountain, Ethan said, which is not ideal. No, she agreed quietly. It wasn't. Teb. He drove back to Silver Hollow at 10 o'clock with more questions than he'd left with and a photocopy of Lena's annotated map folded in his jacket pocket. He hadn't told Tesler about the meeting. He wasn't sure yet what he was going to tell Tesler or when. What he did know was that this had moved completely outside the scope of a county sheriff's investigation, and the correct next move was to escalate it federally, which meant calling people Tesler would know and he didn't, which meant a process that would take time he apparently didn't have, and which meant that in the interim the mountain was still up there with its 60-year-old buried problem and the people who wanted to extract it. He lay awake until 2 in the morning running it in circles, and then gave up and drove back to the office and started pulling everything he could find on Project Carver. He found almost nothing, which, as Lena had implied, was itself informative. There was a brief reference in a 1973 Federal Environmental Survey, a notation about subsurface structures in a mountainous region of central Montana that had been reviewed and addressed per applicable regulations. The language was bureaucratic and bloodless and told him exactly nothing. Everything else he could find through accessible records hit walls, classified markings, redactions, or the particular archival silence that meant a file had been pulled and not replaced. By 4 in the morning, he'd confirmed 2 things. Whatever Project Carver was, it had been real, and someone had worked very hard to make sure it stayed buried, not just physically, but informationally. His desk phone rang at 4:23 a.m. He picked it up. "Sheriff?" It was Marlene calling from her personal cell. Her voice had the tight, controlled quality of someone delivering bad news professionally. "There's been an incident at Lena Voss's cabin." Goss. He drove up the logging road for the second time in 24 hours, this time faster than was wise, his lights cutting through the pre-dawn dark and the road's ice patches catching his rear tires twice on the sharpest curves. The radio traffic he'd picked up on the way out was brief and opaque. Marlene had reported a possible break-in and structural intrusion at the Voss property, no shots fired, subject not on scene. Not on scene. The cabin when he arrived had a window broken on the north side, clean entry, the glass punched inward, a rectangle of black cold where the pane had been. Inside, the evidence was methodical rather than chaotic. Files had been opened and searched but not destroyed. The laptop computers were gone. The radio setup had been partially disassembled and several components removed. The hard drives were gone from the rack, but the maps were still on the wall. Whoever had come in had either not understood what they were looking at or hadn't had time to deal with them. Marlene stood in the middle of the cabin looking at the wall of maps. They knew what they wanted, she said. Communications equipment and data storage, Ethan said. Her surveillance records, her intel. So they know what she knows. They know what was on those drives. He walked to the table where the red hard drive had sat, the one Lena had pointed him toward with the chain of custody documentation. Gone. Or they think they do. He looked at the wall. The annotations were still there in that small, precise handwriting. He photographed every map with his phone, working systematically, section by section. "Where is she?" Marlene asked. "I don't know." His phone buzzed. A text from the same unknown Montana number. 3 words. "I'm not there." He showed it to Marlene. "Well," she said, "that's something." He typed back. "Where?" 30 seconds. Then, "Safer for both of us if you don't know right now. They'll be watching you after last night. I'll reach out when I can." He stood in the middle of the ransacked cabin with Marlene and 2 deputies doing a scene inventory around him, and he felt the shape of the situation shifting under him the way river ice shifts in early spring. Not breaking yet, but moving, adjusting, making sounds that told you it was thinking about it. Well, Grant Holloway found him at noon. Not at the office this time, at the diner on Main Street where Ethan had stopped for coffee and the first food he'd had in 12 hours. Holloway came in and sat down across from him without being invited, which was, Ethan was learning, simply how Grant Holloway operated in spaces he considered his own. "I heard about the cabin," Holloway said. "Word gets around." "This is a small town, Sheriff. Everything gets around." He waved off the waitress who came toward him. "I also heard she's gone." "Ms. Voss is not at her residence. That's accurate." Holloway leaned forward slightly. He had the bearing of a man who believed proximity increased persuasiveness. "I want you to hear something from me directly, not from rumor. I've been making some calls this morning, old contacts, people who still have connections to the right offices." Ethan put his coffee cup down. "What kind of calls?" "The kind that are appropriate when a situation like this develops in my community." He said my community without any apparent awareness of how it sounded. "I have reason to believe I may have some relevant background on what's happening up on that mountain." A particular kind of stillness moved through Ethan. He kept his face neutral. "Tell me." Holloway sat back. Something crossed his face. Not quite discomfort, not quite guilt. Something older than either of those things. "There was a program," he said, "a long time ago. I was involved in a very peripheral way, very junior, toward the tail end of it, 1973. I was 20 years old and I was driving trucks for a logistics unit attached to a Defense Department contractor." "What program?" "I didn't know the name of it then. I just knew we were moving equipment to a mountain site in Montana for what they told us was decommissioning." His jaw shifted. "I drove 3 loads up to a staging area and helped unload them. I was told the materials were being properly disposed of. I had no reason to think otherwise." Ethan watched him. But I heard things. Later, years later, people talk, especially after they've been out long enough and had enough to drink at enough reunions." Holloway's voice had lost some of its usual authority. Not all of it. The man had been performing competent confidence for too long to let it go entirely. But some. The materials weren't destroyed. The project manager, a man named Warwick Steele, diverted them, sealed them in place instead of removing them. I don't know why. Cost savings, maybe? Maybe he was planning to come back for them. Maybe he just didn't want to deal with the paperwork. "Steele," Ethan said. "Dead. 1989. Heart attack." Holloway looked at the table surface. "I should have reported what I heard when I heard it. I know that. I was 30 years old and it was a rumor and I had a career I was building and He stopped. "I told myself it wasn't my problem to solve." Ethan looked at this man who had 2 days ago stood in front of 90 people and explained with great confidence why women couldn't be warriors, and who was now sitting across a diner table looking old in a way that had nothing to do with years. "Did you know about Lena Voss before she moved here?" Ethan said. Holloway frowned. "What? No, I don't. No. Why would I?" "I'm asking every question I have," Ethan said. Don't take it personally. I don't know that woman. You have a way of talking about her for someone who doesn't know her. Holloway's jaw tightened again. I have concerns about the situation. That's different. Your concerns, Ethan said carefully, are noted. Your information is useful. I need you to write down everything you remember about 1973, the staging area location, the names of anyone else who was present, and this Warwick Steele. Everything. Tonight. And Voss? Is not your concern. Sheriff, she killed 2 men. In defense of her life and property, according to the physical evidence. Ethan picked up his coffee. Which is, in Montana, her legal right. Holloway sat with that for a moment. She's not what you think she is, he said again. The same words as yesterday, but they came out differently now. Less confident. More like a man trying to convince himself of something he was starting to doubt. You keep saying that, Ethan said. What I think is that I don't know nearly enough about what's happening on that mountain, and the person who seems to know the most about it is the one you've been most eager to dismiss. He stood, left money on the table for the coffee. Write down everything, Grant. Tonight. He walked out into the cold Main Street afternoon and didn't look back. Tesler called him at 2 o'clock with something in her voice that told him before she spoke that the situation had escalated past county and state jurisdiction. I've been on the phone with DOJ since 9 this morning, she said. They're not telling me much, but they're telling me enough. We need to talk. They met at the county office in a room with a closed door. Tesler had a folder this time, and she spread its contents across the table with the deliberate care of someone who'd been told to be careful about what she shared. The 2 deceased, she said. We ran their associations. Both had previous contact with a security contracting firm called Bridgemore Consulting Group. It's registered in Delaware, operational address in Northern Virginia, and it has a very clean public profile. She slid a printed page across. It also has a client list that the FBI has been building a file on for 2 years. We're talking organized movement of restricted materials on behalf of buyers in places. Places, Ethan said. Places I can't name in a county office. She looked at him steadily. What I can tell you is that Bridgemore has been linked to 2 other incidents in the last 18 months involving Cold War-era materials from improperly decommissioned federal sites. One in Idaho, one in Colorado. She tapped the folder. Both times they got there before federal investigators. Both times materials were moved, and the trail went cold. Ethan thought about Lena saying, I'm out of time. How close are they to completing whatever they're doing up there, he said. That's the problem. We don't know. The FBI field office is sending people, but they're coming from Billings. That's a 4-hour drive in current road conditions. The DOJ contact I spoke to this morning indicated we should assume Bridgemore is operating on a compressed timeline, meaning they may already be in the extraction phase. Ethan put both hands flat on the table. So we have potentially a matter of hours. Potentially, Tesler looked at him. Is there anything you haven't told me, Sheriff? About the Voss woman? About last night's break-in? About anything that happened since yesterday afternoon? He held her gaze for 3 seconds. Then he took the folded map copy out of his jacket pocket and slid it across the table. She looked at it. At the annotations. At the marked locations. Where did this come from? Lena Voss? When? Last night. Tesler's expression didn't change dramatically, but something behind it did. A recalibration happening in real time. She met with you. She reached out. I met her. She has detailed information about the site, the layout, the access corridors, the history of the project, more than anyone I've talked to in 2 days of pulling records. He paused. I also spoke this morning with a local man named Grant Holloway, who had peripheral involvement in the 1973 decommissioning operation. He confirms the materials were not properly disposed of. Tesler was quiet for a moment. She looked at the map. Where's Voss now? I don't know. She's in contact. She reached out after the break-in. He pulled out his phone and showed her the text exchange, all 3 words of it. Tesler read it and sat back. She knows they'll be tracking you. Yes. She's staying loose until she figures out her next move. Tesler said it without judgment, almost with something like professional recognition. Okay, here's what I need you to do. When she contacts you again, and she will, I need her to come in, not to the county office. There's a Forest Service facility on the north side of the mountain, 12 miles out. I can have FBI assets there within... Ethan's radio crackled. Shrike's voice, tight and fast. Sheriff, we've got a situation developing on the logging road. Motion sensors at the county barrier gate are showing multiple vehicles moving up. At least 3. Moving fast. They both looked at the map on the table. 3 vehicles. Moving fast up a mountain road in January toward a site that contained materials that shouldn't exist and that someone was in the process of taking. Ethan's phone buzzed simultaneously. The unknown number again. He answered it. They're moving, Lena said. No preamble. Full convoy. They must have the location confirmed and they're going for it tonight. They're not going to wait. How do you know? Because I can see them. Her voice was steady and focused, the same quality it had in the cabin, the sound of someone operating on trained attention rather than fear. I'm on the North Ridge. I have eyes on the road. Voss, I need you to... I know what you need, she said, and I know what you have time for and what you don't. You have federal backup coming from Billings, which means you have nobody useful for 4 hours. They have 3 vehicles. I count at minimum 8 personnel, and they're 20 minutes from the primary bunker entrance. Ethan looked at Tesler. She was already on her own phone. You cannot engage that many people alone, he said. A pause. 1 beat, 2. I know, Lena said quietly, and something in her voice shifted, just slightly, just for a moment, in a way that told him this was costing her something to say. That's why I need to make a call I've been avoiding for 8 months. What call? There's someone in Silver Hollow who knows this mountain, she said. Someone who was there in 1973 and who has spent 50 years knowing he should have said something and not saying it. A pause. Tell Grant Holloway it's time. The line went dead. Outside the county office window, the last light was dropping off the ridgeline in shades of gray and iron, and somewhere up in the dark of the mountain, 8 armed men with a confirmed objective and no interest in leaving witnesses were 20 minutes from a buried secret that had been waiting 6 decades for the wrong hands to find it. Ethan grabbed his jacket and his keys. Tesler looked up from her phone. Where are you going? To tell an old man it's time to pay a debt, he said, and walked out the door into the cold. Grant Holloway answered the door in a flannel shirt with a glass of bourbon in his hand, and when he saw Ethan's face, he put the glass down on the side table without finishing it. She called you, he said. She called me. Ethan stepped inside without being invited, which was something he'd never done before, and the fact that Holloway moved aside without objecting told him the old man had been sitting here waiting for something like this. She said to tell you it's time. Holloway stood very still in the entryway of his ranch house, a big, well-kept space with mounted trophy heads on the walls, and framed commendations and photographs of a younger, squarer-jawed version of himself standing with people in uniform. 50 years of curated identity looking down from every surface. How many? Holloway said. 8 minimum. 3 vehicles. 20 minutes from the primary entrance when she called, maybe 12 minutes ago. Holloway turned and walked toward the back of the house without another word. Ethan followed him through the kitchen and into a room he hadn't seen. A back room, narrow, with a gun safe on one wall and a work table on the other. Holloway spun the combination and pulled the safe open with the practiced motion of someone who'd done it 10,000 times. She knows about Carver, Ethan said. I figured that out this morning. Holloway was pulling gear from the safe, a rifle case, a plate carrier, a radio set that looked military surplus and well-maintained. How much does she know? More than you, more than me, more than anyone I've talked to in 2 days. Holloway paused with the plate carrier in his hands. He looked at it for a moment rather than at Ethan. What unit was she? She won't say specifically. But you have a guess. I have several guesses, Ethan said. None of them make me feel better about the fact that 8 armed professionals are currently on their way up a mountain to recover weapons-grade materials from a site she's been monitoring alone for months. Holloway set the plate carrier on the table and started checking pockets with automatic hands. You said she needs me to make calls. She said you know people. I know people. He reached for the radio set. How much time do we have before the FBI gets here from Billings? Tesler said 4 hours under current road conditions. Holloway looked at the clock on the wall. Then he looked at Ethan. Something moved through his face, not quite the expression of a man making a decision, more like the expression of a man accepting one that had been waiting for him for a long time. Get on the phone with Tesler. Tell her to get on a line with the DOJ Emergency Response Coordinator. Not the field office, the coordinator. Tell her to use the phrase deferred decommission, Category 3. She'll know what that means, or she'll find someone who does. What does it mean? It means the materials in that bunker are not just old and dangerous. They have a specific classification that triggers a federal rapid response protocol. It bypasses the normal FBI chain and goes directly to a joint task unit that exists specifically for this category of incident. He paused. I know. It exists because I spent 15 years on a reserve advisory panel that was created partly because of what happened in 1973. What I should have done then, reported what I heard, pushed for an audit of that site, I didn't do. And this panel was created because enough similar situations came up that someone in Washington decided there needed to be a mechanism for handling them. He said it simply, without self-pity. I've known about that panel and that phrase for 15 years, and I never once used it to fix the problem I helped create. Ethan was already dialing Tesler. And the people you're calling? Holloway picked up his own phone. People I served with who are not entirely retired, he said. People who still know how to move fast and who understand the difference between the right thing to do and the easy thing to do. He said the last part looking at the wall rather than at Ethan, and Ethan understood he wasn't being descriptive. He was being confessional. Tesler got the phrase into the right hands at 6:44 p.m. Whatever it triggered happened fast, faster than Ethan had expected from any federal mechanism he'd ever dealt with. By 7:15, she was calling back with a clipped, careful voice to say that a specialized response team was being redirected from a training operation in Wyoming and could reach the mountain in approximately 90 minutes, and that their orders were to treat the situation as a live extraction interdiction scenario. 90 minutes. Ethan relayed this to Lena through the burner number. The response came back in under a minute. Not enough. They'll be inside in 40. He showed the message to Tesler. She looked at it. Can she slow them down? I don't know what she can do, Ethan said honestly. I've known her for 2 days. Can she buy us time without engaging directly? He called the number. 1 ring. I heard, Lena said before he could speak. She'd apparently reached the same conclusion. I need something from you. What? Holloway. I need him on comms. He knows the terrain around the north access point. He was there in '73. He knows the topography. I've got maps, but local knowledge fills gaps that maps don't. Ethan looked at Holloway, who was pulling on the plate carrier with the slightly stiff movements of a man in his 60s, whose body remembered the motions even when it protested them. He's listening. Mr. Holloway. Her voice shifted, not softer, but more direct, stripped of the particular careful layers she used with people she hadn't decided to trust. The north access path in '73 was the drainage culvert on the eastern approach still functional when your unit came through? Holloway went very still. He looked at the phone in Ethan's hand like it had said something in a language he hadn't heard in decades. It was functional, he said, loud enough for the phone to pick up. Seasonal. It would have been frozen this time of year. Good. That's what I thought. They'll have to go around it, which adds 6 to 8 minutes to their approach if they're coming from the logging road. They'll know that if they've done proper reconnaissance. They have, she said, but reconnaissance and night movement in January in Montana are 2 different things. They'll lose another 4 minutes at minimum on the switchback above the culvert. The ice is bad there tonight. Holloway pulled his jacket on. How do you know how bad the ice is? Because I walked it 2 hours ago. A pause. Holloway looked at Ethan. The expression on his face was something Ethan had not seen there before. Not the confident authority of the man who'd held court at the veterans' dinner, Not the defensive justifications of the man in the diner. Something older and more fundamental than either. Something that looked like recognition. "All right," Holloway said quietly to the phone. "Tell me what you need." Lena's two calls that she'd been avoiding for 8 months were Holloway and one other. The other arrived at Ethan's office at 8:10 p.m. in a truck with Wyoming plates and sat in the parking lot for 3 minutes before coming inside. Her name was Petra Sold, 51, compact, with close-cropped silver hair, and the kind of physical economy that came from spending a career moving through spaces where being efficient was a survival trait. She had a duffel bag over one shoulder, and she set it on the floor beside the chair she took without being offered one, and she looked at Ethan with eyes that were doing a rapid, thorough assessment of everything in the room. "You're the sheriff," she said. "Yes." "Lena tell you about me?" "She told me to expect someone. That's it." Petra nodded like that was exactly the right amount. "I was her team medic. 3 years. We did the same kind of work she did, which I'm not going to describe to you before you ask." She glanced at Tesler, who was standing by the window. "You're federal." "State investigator coordinating with DOJ," Tesler said. "Close enough." Petra looked back at Ethan. "What's the situation as of right now?" He laid it out. Convoy on the mountain, timeline, the 90-minute wait for the response team, Lena's position on the North Ridge. Petra listened without interrupting and without any visible emotional reaction to any of it, in the particular way of someone who processes information first and responds to it second. When he finished, she unzipped the duffel and laid 3 things on the table: a radio set with a military-style handset, a medical kit that was larger and more comprehensive than anything standard, and a case with a lock on it that she didn't open. "She needs an explosive specialist and a second shooter," Petra said. "I can get her one of those. The other—" She looked at Holloway, who was in the corner with his rifle case. "You former military?" "Retired LTC," Holloway said. "How recent is your long range?" A pause. "Recent enough?" Petra looked at him for 2 seconds with the evaluating flatness of someone deciding whether to rely on a piece of equipment they hadn't personally inspected. "Okay, what else does she have up there?" "Just herself," Ethan said. Petra pressed her lips together briefly. "Of course she does." She picked up the radio. "Can I use this room for 10 minutes? The call between Petra and Lena lasted 9 minutes. Ethan waited in the hallway with Tesler, who was running her own communications with the response team coordinator. At one point, he heard Petra's voice rise briefly, not angry, just emphatic, and then drop back to the controlled murmur he couldn't make out through the door. When Petra came out, she had the radio clipped to her jacket and the duffel back over her shoulder. "I need a vehicle," she said, "something with clearance, and I need someone who knows the road up to the North Ridge approach." "I'll drive," Ethan said. "You're law enforcement." "I'm aware of that." This is going to get into a space where law enforcement creates a legal problem for what needs to happen. Ethan looked at her steadily. "I'm the senior law enforcement officer in this county. I have a direct line to the federal coordinator, and I am not sending you and a 63-year-old retired lieutenant colonel up a mountain alone while I sit in my office and wait." He picked up his coat. "I'll drive." Petra looked at him for a moment. "You're going to do exactly what I say when I say it. No questions, no hesitation, no jurisdiction. Within reason." "No, not within reason, just exactly." She held his gaze. "People die in the gap between what someone was told and what they actually did. I've carried those people, so when I say do something, you do it." Ethan thought about it for approximately 1 second. "All right. Good." She turned to Holloway. "You too." Holloway picked up his rifle case. "Lead the way, boy." They drove up the mountain in Ethan's truck with the lights off for the last 3 miles, which meant Ethan drove on memory and gut, and the dim ambient light of a Montana winter sky that had enough stars behind the cloud breaks to give him just enough to work with. Holloway sat in back with his rifle across his knees. Petra was in the passenger seat with the radio handset to her ear, speaking in short, clipped bursts that Ethan couldn't fully parse. A mix of call signs and brevity codes that told him the comms structure between her and Lena had been built and used before, that this was not two people improvising a language, but two people returning to one they already knew. He caught fragments. North element, static, copy. Thermal on the west approach, two moving. Hold. Then silence. Then understood. We're 12 out. He drove. The pull-off Petra directed him to was a wide spot in the Forest Service Road, about a mile below the ridge. Not the same pull-off as his meeting with Lena the night before. Further east, sheltered by a dense stand of lodgepole pine that would hide the truck from anyone on the road below. He cut the engine. The silence came down immediately, total and cold. "From here we walk," Petra said. "How far?" 40 minutes if we move right." She looked at Holloway. "You doing okay?" "I'm fine," he said with slightly more edge than was necessary. "Good. Because I need you on the west spur by the time we reach the tree line. That's a harder angle." She held up the locked case and opened it. Inside were two radio earpieces and a small device Ethan didn't immediately recognize. A compact unit with a screen, about the size of a thick paperback, that Petra powered on and studied briefly before handing one earpiece to Holloway and one to Ethan. "She has a thermal scope on the ridge," Petra said. "This is receiving her feed. Don't look at it while you're moving. You'll walk into a tree. Use it when you're static." Ethan clipped the earpiece in. Immediately he could hear breathing. Slow, controlled, slightly elevated, and the faint ambient sound of wind over a microphone. Lena, on the ridge. Already there. He had no idea how long she'd been in position. "Voss." Petra kept her voice low. "We're on the ground. 12 minutes." "Copy." Lena's voice in his ear was different from the phone. Sharper, cleaner, stripped of everything that wasn't information. "Update. Convoy has staged at the lower platform. They're gearing up. I count 9 now, one more than initial. One of them has a case I haven't seen before. Large, wheeled, the kind you use for sensitive equipment transport. They're close to moving. Time to entry? At their current pace, 22 minutes to the primary hatch. We'll be in position in 12. A pause. Do you have the secondary covered? Working on it? A very brief silence. There's a problem. Petra stopped walking. Talk to me. The man with the case. I've been watching his movement pattern for the last 40 minutes. He's not Bridgemore. A pause that carried weight. His gear is different. His comms are different. His movement discipline is different. The others are contractors. He's something else. Principal? Or the principal's representative. Either way, he's the one who knows what's in that bunker and how to handle it. If he gets inside, he can move faster than we planned. Ethan was moving through the dark timber with Petra and Holloway, his breath loud in his ears, his boots finding purchase on the frozen ground by feel, and he was listening to this conversation happening in his earpiece with the surreal quality of a man who had driven to work 2 days ago, expecting his most complicated problem to be a dispute over a property boundary. Hold on, Holloway said, low. He had stopped walking. Ethan nearly ran into him. Petra stopped. What? Holloway was looking at something through the trees to the north. Not with a scope, just looking, the way someone looks when they're trying to confirm something they think they already know. The primary hatch. Where is it exactly on the north face? Petra described the coordinates Lena had given them. Holloway shook his head slowly. That's not the primary. Silence. Say that again, Lena said in the earpiece. The hatch at that location. In 1973, that was the secondary access, maintenance only. The primary entrance was cut into the rock face about 60 yards northwest of that position. It was camouflaged, looked like natural cliff face from the outside. You had to know exactly where to press. Lena was quiet for 3 seconds. 4. You're saying they're going in the wrong entrance. If they're targeting the coordinates from the original survey maps, yes. Those maps were deliberately altered before they went on record. I know because I was present when the project manager decided to alter them. His voice had gone flat in a particular way. I thought I was watching routine security protocol at the time. That means the chamber they access from the secondary entrance is the outer storage. Lena's voice had shifted, something moving fast behind it. The primary chamber, the one with the Category 3 materials, is only accessible from the main entrance, which they don't have. Not yet, Holloway said. But if that man with the case is what you think he is, he may have access to the original unaltered plans. Another silence, longer. Then we need to move, Lena said. Now, Petra, change of plan. Holloway goes to the primary entrance coordinates, not the west spur. He needs to be there before they figure out they're in the wrong place. That's an exposed position, Petra said. I know. He'll be alone until we can, I know. A pause. Holloway, are you hearing this? I'm hearing it, he said. I need you to hold that entrance, whatever it takes. Can you do that? Holloway stood in the dark timber for a moment. The cold was deep and clear, and the stars were showing through a gap in the cloud cover to the east. And Ethan watched this man who had spent 50 years being the loudest voice in any room go very quiet in a way that had nothing performative in it. I can do that, he said. He peeled off to the north without another word, moving with more speed and surety than Ethan had expected from him. Not young man movement, but competent movement, the motion of a body that still remembered what it was built for, even when the mind had gotten comfortable forgetting. Ethan and Petra reached the tree line above the staging area 11 minutes later. Below them, in a natural depression that the topography shielded from the road, the convoy was arranged in a loose triangle. 3 vehicles, lights off, but engines presumably warm, the heat signatures visible as distortions in the cold air. 9 figures in dark gear were assembled near the vehicles. The man with the case stood slightly apart from the others. Ethan pressed himself against a pine trunk and raised the thermal receiver Petra had given him. The image resolved in pale green. The heat signatures of the figures below made them look ghostly, each one a bright outline against the cold ground. He found the man with the case. Even through the thermal imaging, the difference in bearing was obvious. The contractors moved with the slightly aggressive looseness of men who'd done violent work before and would do it again without much reflection. The man with the case was still. Very still, in a way that reminded Ethan of someone. Lena, he said quietly. I see him, she said in his ear. He's watching the others, not the mountain. He knows the mountain. A pause. He's managing people, not terrain. He's done this before. Who is he? I don't know yet, but I've been trying to run his physical profile against a very short list of people who would have access to the original Carver documentation. And the way he holds that case, a brief silence. That's a man who knows exactly what's inside it and is not nervous about it. That's familiarity, not confidence. He's handled this material before. The figures below began to move toward the mountain slope. Organized 2 by 2, the contractors falling into a practiced formation with the man and his case in the middle. Protected position. They moved with purpose toward the secondary hatch coordinates. They're going in, Petra said. Let them, Lena said. They'll hit the outer chamber, realize they don't have what they came for, and then he'll pull the original plans and they'll redirect to the primary entrance. A beat. That's when it has to happen. When they're between the 2 access points, exposed, and before they reach Holloway's position. How long? 8 to 12 minutes. Depends on how fast they figure out the discrepancy. Ethan watched them disappear into the dark of the slope. He looked at Petra. She was already moving laterally along the tree line, finding a position that gave her a clear line down the slope. Sheriff, she said quietly. I know. Do what I'm told. No questions. I was going to say, stay behind the tree. He stayed behind the tree. The waiting was a particular kind of hard. Not the hard of doing something difficult, but the hard of not doing anything while something difficult was happening somewhere you couldn't see. Listening to the slow, controlled breathing of a woman on a ridge 900 yards away through a wire in your ear, and watching the dark slope where 9 armed men had just disappeared and trying not to calculate odds. 7 minutes in, Lena's voice came back. Movement. 2 of them are coming back out. A pause. They're on their radios. He's figured it out. How much time? Petra. The primary entrance is 60 yards northwest. If they move directly, Holloway intercepts in 3 minutes. A pause. Holloway. You're reading this? Holloway's voice, slightly elevated from the pace of movement, but controlled. In position. I have the entrance in sight. Copy. When they come around that rock face, she stopped. Wait. Everyone waited. He's not sending the team. Something sharp in her voice. He's going himself. One escort, he's moving to the primary entrance alone, faster than the team. A pause. He knows if he stops to redirect the whole group, he loses time. He's trying to get there first and get inside. Holloway. 1+1. Moving fast. Your position in 2 minutes. Understood. Do not let that man inside. Holloway said something that Ethan didn't catch clearly, a half word maybe, or just breath. Then, I've got him. What happened in the next 4 minutes, Ethan could only partially piece together from the audio in his earpiece and the distant sounds that carried down the slope in fragments. A sharp command in a voice he didn't recognize. Then Holloway's voice, flat and certain. Stop right there. A pause. Another voice, accented, controlled, the voice of someone accustomed to being obeyed. You don't understand what you're interfering with. Then Holloway. I understand exactly what I'm interfering with. I helped put it there, set the case down. Then a sound that was not a voice. Then silence. Holloway. Petra's voice was sharp. Report. 3 seconds. 4. Ethan's hand tightened on the pine trunk. I'm here. Holloway's voice was steady but slightly different. Slightly. Strained. He's down. His escort ran. I have the case. A pause. I need a minute. Are you hit? No. I'm not hit. Another pause. He had a knife. I didn't. A sound that might have been exhaled air. I didn't see the knife. Holloway. I said, I'm not hit. Sharper. I'm fine. The case is secured. Lena's voice came in over the top of it. The team has heard the commotion. They're redirecting back up slope, 7 of them, moving fast. A pause. 2 beats. 3. Petra, I need you to hold the lateral approach. Sheriff, get to Holloway's position and secure the case. Do not let the case leave that location under any circumstances. Ethan was already moving before she finished the sentence. He went up the slope at something between a fast walk and a run, his boots punching through the snow crust in an uneven rhythm, the cold burning his lungs in that specific high-altitude way that told you it was serious cold regardless of how numb you'd gotten to it, the thermal receiver banging against his hip. He could hear Petra moving somewhere to his left, quieter than him, more efficient, threading through the trees with the ease of someone who'd done exactly this in worse conditions. Holloway was behind the primary rock face when Ethan reached him, a natural shelf of granite that jutted from the slope and created a narrow overhang, and Holloway was pressed against it with the rifle across his body and the large wheeled case at his feet, looking slightly less composed than Ethan had yet seen him. Not shaken, not that, but returned to something more human than the polished commander he usually projected. There was a bruise developing along his left forearm that hadn't been there an hour ago. The escort, Ethan said, ran west. Holloway looked at the case. The man had original documentation, original, physical copies, not digital. He had the actual construction schematics from 1961. His voice carried something that Ethan couldn't immediately name. Someone kept those documents for 60 years. Someone stored them and protected them and eventually used them to find this place. We'll figure out who. I know who. Holloway looked at him. Steel didn't work alone. I told you he was dead. But his family, his son is 60 years old and is currently the director of a private capital fund that has 3 known clients in Eastern Europe. He paused. I started making calls after we talked at the diner. I should have made those calls 20 years ago. Below them on the slope, somewhere in the dark timber, 7 armed contractors were moving upward. Ethan could hear them now. Not clearly, but enough. The crack of boot on frozen ground, the faint carrier signal of radios. In his earpiece, Lena's breathing changed, a barely perceptible shift in rhythm. Not faster, exactly, but different. The shift of someone transitioning from static observation to active operation. "I have the lead element," she said. Her voice was entirely level. "Petra, west side is yours. Sheriff, stay at the entrance. Holloway, if anyone reaches your position—" "I know what to do," Holloway said. "I know you do." A pause that was just long enough to carry something more than tactics. Then, "Okay, here we go." The first shot came from somewhere so far up the slope that Ethan barely heard the report. A flat, compressed sound that the mountain swallowed almost immediately, arriving a full second after the effect it produced, which was a shout of alarm from somewhere below and the sudden scrambling of organized movement becoming disorganized. The second shot came 11 seconds later. Then the mountain went very quiet, and then the remaining contractors started making a great deal of noise, and in his earpiece, Ethan heard Lena draw one slow, measured breath in the dark above him, and then exhale. And the sound of it was not triumphant and not afraid. It was simply the sound of someone doing exactly what they had spent years being made for, in exactly the moment that required it, on a frozen mountain in January, alone and efficient and very, very good. Below them, the convoy's formation was gone. Ethan could hear it falling apart in the dark. Orders that nobody was following, movement that had no direction. Petra was somewhere in the timber to the west and doing whatever Petra did, which he still didn't entirely know but was rapidly developing respect for. Holloway stood next to him with one hand on the case and the rifle in the other and said nothing. Just listened to the mountain. Then, from somewhere in the darkness below, a new sound. Not a contractor, not radio traffic, not boots on frozen ground. A vehicle engine starting up, moving not away from the mountain, but along its base. Westward, fast, headlights off. "Lena," Ethan said. "I see it." Her voice had changed again. A tightening, something controlled coming under pressure. "That's not the convoy vehicles. That's a separate vehicle. It was staged somewhere I couldn't see from this position." A pause. 2 beats. "There's someone else on this mountain who I did not account for." The vehicle lights came on suddenly. Briefly, just long enough for Ethan to catch the silhouette moving west along the base of the slope. And in the second before they went off again, he saw something through the thermal receiver that stopped him cold. The vehicle was moving toward a position on the western approach that he recognized from the map in his jacket pocket. The third bunker entrance. The one Lena's map marked as sealed. Confirmed. "Lena." His voice came out harder than he intended. "The western entrance." "I know." And for the first time in 2 days, in everything he'd heard from her, there was something in her voice that was not quite calm. Not fear. Something more specific than fear. The sound of a person who has run the best operation they could and has just discovered the variable they didn't know to account for. "I don't have the angle from this position. I can't—" A brief silence. "I cannot reach the western approach from where I am." The vehicle disappeared behind the rock face. Whoever was in it had known about the third entrance before tonight, and they had just driven directly to it in the dark, without hesitation, as if they had done it before. Ethan was running before he made the conscious decision to run. The western approach was 400 yards along the base of the slope. He knew this from the map, from the hours he'd spent looking at Lena's annotations. And he went through the dark timber at a pace that was too fast for the terrain and the visibility, catching branches across his face and punching through snow crust that dropped him to his knee twice. And he didn't slow down because the alternative was arriving too late, and he'd already seen what too late looked like on this mountain. In his earpiece, Petra's voice, tight. "I'm cut off. There's 2 contractors between me and the western face. I cannot move without— stand by." Then sounds that weren't words. Then Holloway. "I'm coming down from the primary." "Negative," Lena said immediately. "Hold the entrance. If anyone reaches that case while we're repositioning, the case is inside the primary chamber. I moved it 30 seconds ago. The hatch is sealed from inside and I have the manual lock engaged." A pause. "I know what I'm doing, Voss." A silence that was shorter than it felt. "Okay," she said. "Western approach, both of you. I'm trying to reposition, but I'm going to lose the angle for another 6 minutes minimum." 6 minutes. Ethan ran. He came around the base of a granite outcrop and saw the vehicle, a dark SUV, engine still ticking with heat, parked tight against the rock face in a natural alcove that would have been nearly invisible from the road above. The western entrance was exactly where Lena's map had marked it. A section of cliff face that looked natural until you were within 10 feet of it and could see the hairline seam of a constructed frame behind decades of lichen and weathering. The entrance was open. A rectangle of black against the gray rock, maybe 4 feet wide and 6 feet tall, the hatch swung inward and propped with something. A case, he saw. A small, hard-sided case that someone had used as a doorstop to keep the entrance clear for their return. Ethan stopped at the entrance and pressed against the rock face and listened. Footsteps inside. Moving away from him, deeper in. One set. Moving with the confidence of someone who knew where they were going. He looked at the SUV. One occupant. The driver, who was still in the vehicle, engine off now, waiting. The driver's window was down 2 inches and Ethan could see the shape of a head, a phone screen illuminating a face he couldn't make out clearly. He made a decision that Petra would probably have told him not to make, went to the SUV, and put his hand on the door handle. The driver turned. Late 40s, sharp-featured, wearing the kind of civilian field jacket that tried very hard to look civilian. His phone dropped to his lap and his hand went toward the center console. "Sheriff's Department," Ethan said very clearly and very close to the window gap, put both hands on the dashboard. The man's hand stopped moving. "Dashboard," Ethan said again. "Now." The hands went to the dashboard. Ethan opened the door and pulled the man out and had him face down on the frozen ground with his wrists zip-tied behind him. Petra had given him 3 zip ties along with the earpiece, and he'd thought at the time it was presumptuous, and now he was grateful. In under 40 seconds. "Voss," he said into the earpiece. "Driver is secured. One person inside moving toward deeper chambers." "I know." Her voice was coming in slightly differently now. She was moving, he realized. The ambient sound behind her voice had changed. "I've repositioned. I have the entrance in sight. Do not go inside." "Someone's already inside." "I know. I said do not go inside." He stayed outside. He looked at the open hatch and the darkness beyond it and the case propped against the frame, and he stayed outside. Holloway arrived 2 minutes later, breathing harder than he'd have wanted anyone to notice, and stood next to Ethan against the rock face and looked at the open entrance. "Who went in?" he said. "Don't know yet." "That entrance," Holloway said, catching his breath with measured deliberateness, "leads to the 3rd chamber, the one that's been sealed since 1974. He looked at the hatch. In the original construction, the 3rd chamber was isolated from the others. Separate access, separate systems. It was designed that way because the materials inside it had a different handling classification. Different how? Holloway looked at him. The first 2 chambers had materials that were dangerous in the way that many Cold War-era stored substances are dangerous, improperly documented, potentially unstable after decades, requiring specialist handling. The 3rd chamber. He stopped. The 3rd chamber had materials that were dangerous in a way that the project manager himself was apparently not comfortable leaving in the same structure as everything else. A pause. Which should tell you something about what's in there. It told Ethan quite a lot. "Lena," he said. "I hear you." Her voice was very controlled. "I'm aware of what's in the 3rd chamber. I've been aware for 6 weeks. It's part of why I—" A brief silence. "It's part of why I didn't sleep much the last 6 weeks." "Who goes into a place like that alone at night?" "Someone who's done it before," she said. "And who has a buyer waiting." A pause. "Or someone who's running out of time and making a decision they know is the last one they'll make if it goes wrong." She said it without drama, just flat assessment. Then, movement at the entrance. Ethan and Holloway both pressed against the rock face on either side of the hatch. Ethan drew his service weapon and held it at his side. The person who came through the hatch was not what he'd expected. She was 60, maybe 62, well-dressed under the field jacket, not tactical gear, but actual quality clothing, the kind that cost real money, layered practically against the cold, but with an underlying attention to presentation that felt incongruous on a frozen Montana mountainside. Her hair was silver and short, and she carried a hardened transport cylinder under one arm, about 18 inches long, sealed with what looked like a pressure lock, and she was moving with the focused efficiency of someone executing a plan she'd rehearsed many times. She saw Ethan and Holloway and she stopped. For a moment, nobody moved. "Set it down," Ethan said. "The cylinder. Set it down on the ground. Step back." The woman looked at him with an expression that was neither fear nor surprise. It was closer to calculation. Her eyes moved from Ethan to Holloway to the zip-tied driver on the ground to the tree line, looking for options, running a count. "You don't know what that is," she said. Her voice was accented, Eastern European maybe, or somewhere adjacent. The kind of accent that had been professionally softened over decades of use in English, but not entirely removed. "I know what it isn't," Ethan said. "It isn't leaving this mountain." "Sheriff." Her voice had changed. She'd landed on a strategy and she was using it. Reasonable. Professional. The voice of a person who solved problems through negotiation. "My name is Nadia Kovac. I represent interests that have been working toward a responsible resolution of this situation for set the cylinder down. For several years, the materials in that chamber require specialist handling that no county law enforcement agency is equipped to provide. I am equipped. My organization has the technical infrastructure to safely transport and neutralize." "On the ground," Ethan said. "Last time." Kovac looked at him for 3 full seconds. Then she looked at the tree line again. "Don't," Lena's voice said in Ethan's earpiece. "She's looking for an angle behind you. There's nobody there." Petra's still held up west. "But she doesn't know that yet. Give her another second." Ethan didn't move. Kovac's gaze came back from the tree line and settled on him. Whatever she'd been calculating, the calculation had produced a result she didn't like. She crouched slowly and set the cylinder on the frozen ground. "Step back," Ethan said. "Further. Against the rock." She stepped back. Holloway picked up the cylinder. His face, when he straightened, was the face of a man holding something that he'd spent 50 years being complicit in avoiding, and the weight of that was visible in the set of his jaw and the way he held his arms slightly away from his body. "There are 4 more containers inside," Kovac said. "You cannot leave them unsealed." "No," Ethan agreed. "We can't. Your specialist team will not arrive in time to properly secure them before the temperature cycling in that chamber causes—" "Lena," Ethan said. "Already on it," she said. "I've been in contact with the response team coordinator for the last 8 minutes. They've rerouted. Helicopter, not vehicles. ETA 23 minutes. I've given them the 3rd chamber specifications and the material classification. They have the right equipment." A pause. "I gave them the classification 6 weeks ago, as a contingency." Ethan looked at Kovac. "How long have you been planning this?" Kovac's expression shifted slightly. Not quite a smile, not quite contempt. Something that acknowledged a game had been played, and she was now processing the fact that she'd lost it. "Long enough," she said. "How long has your family been planning it?" A silence. Her eyes changed. Something behind them moved quickly, and was controlled just as quickly. "I don't know what you mean." "It's steel," Holloway said. He was still holding the cylinder carefully against his chest. He looked at her steadily. "Warwick Steele was my father," she said. Flat. No performance. "And he spent 30 years trying to correct what he'd done and dying before he could. So yes." Something underneath the professional control surfaced briefly. Not grief, not rage, something older and more complicated than either. "Yes, I've been planning this for a long time." Nobody said anything for a moment. The mountain wind moved through the pine tops above them and came down cold on the back of Ethan's neck. "He was trying to correct it," Holloway said. Not a question, not agreement, just turning the words over. "He found buyers," Kovac said. "Legitimate buyers. Organizations with the infrastructure to neutralize the materials rather than weaponize them. He spent years building those connections, but he died before he could reach the materials, and his documentation was incomplete." She looked at the cylinder in Holloway's hands. "I completed it." "Through Bridgemore," Ethan said. Bridgemore was a means to an end. They didn't know the full scope of what they were retrieving. "2 of their people are dead on this mountain." Something crossed her face at that. Not the thing he expected. Not guilt exactly, but something adjacent. The expression of a person who had made calculations that had human cost, and who was not entirely comfortable with that cost even when they'd accepted it. "I know," she said. "That was not the plan." "No plan survives," Lena said in his earpiece, very quietly, almost to herself. The helicopter arrived in 21 minutes. It came in low over the ridge from the east, a large military-adjacent aircraft with no visible markings that landed on the flat area above the logging road with a competence that told Ethan the pilot had done this in worse terrain. 8 people came off it, not FBI, not DOJ, in any configuration he recognized. They moved like the people Petra moved like and communicated in the brevity codes Petra used, and when the team lead identified herself to Ethan, she showed him credentials that had a designation he'd never seen before, and told him that for the next 4 hours, his job was to maintain a perimeter and let them work. He maintained the perimeter. Lena came down from the ridge at 10:40 p.m. He didn't hear her coming. She was simply not there. And then she was stepping out of the tree line in dark gear with the rifle broken down and packed, her face showing the cold in the particular way of someone who had been outside and static for a very long time. She looked at the helicopter, at the team moving in and out of the western entrance, at Kovac sitting zip-tied against the rock face with a response team member standing nearby. Then she looked at Ethan. "You went in the vehicle," she said. "Yes. I told you not to go inside." "I didn't go inside. I went to the vehicle." He paused. "There's a difference." She looked at him for a moment. Then something moved through her face that was close to what other people might call almost smiling. "There's a difference," she said. Petra came out of the timber from the west with 2 contractors zip-tied ahead of her, moving them along with the efficiency of someone herding difficult animals. And when she saw Lena, she stopped and looked at her for a full 3 seconds. "You relocated," she said. "I had to reposition. From 900 yards to Don't," Lena said. "I'm just saying the angle you had to work at from the eastern—" "Petra." Petra pressed her lips together. "You're welcome, she said, and walked the contractors toward the response team, and didn't look back, though Ethan had the distinct impression that her not looking back was itself a form of communication. Holloway was sitting on a rock near the primary entrance with the transport cylinder beside him, guarded by a response team member. When Lena walked toward him, he stood up. Not automatically, the way people stand out of reflex. He stood up deliberately, with the full intention of standing. She stopped about 4 feet from him. He looked at her. She looked at him. The mountain cold pushed between them, and the helicopter rotors were spinning down into silence, and somewhere below the tree line, the remaining contractors were being rounded up by a team that moved through the dark like they owned it. "I should have reported it in 1973, Holloway said. "Yeah," she said. "You should have." He nodded. He'd apparently not expected her to soften that, and the fact that she didn't seem to land better than softening would have. "I held the entrance." "I know, thank you. I'm sorry about what I said at the dinner about, he gestured vaguely. "You didn't know," she said. "Most people don't. That's fine." "It's not fine," he said. "I knew enough to know I didn't know. He looked at the cylinder. "I chose the easier version of what I knew." He looked back at her. "I've been doing that for a long time." Lena looked at him for a moment, and then she turned and looked at the mountain above them. The dark slope, the rock faces, the tree line where the helicopter team was now moving with their lights. She looked at it the way someone looks at a thing they've been studying from a distance for months, and are finally standing close enough to see the details. "The materials will be properly secured now," she said. "The right people have them." "Because of you." She didn't answer that directly. "Because it needed to happen," she said. "I just made sure it did." The debrief started at midnight and lasted until nearly 4 in the morning. They did it in the Forest Service facility on the north side of the mountain, a squat, utilitarian building with fluorescent lights and folding tables and the permanent smell of institutional coffee. The response team coordinator was a woman named Ashby, who was 45, gray-suited, and who had the quality of someone who had run a large number of these conversations, and who was going to get exactly the information she needed, regardless of how long it took or how uncomfortable the process became. She started with Ethan, which he appreciated. It meant the frame of the evening got established through official law enforcement channels before she moved to the more complicated territory. Then she moved to Lena. Ethan stayed in the room. He wasn't sure he was supposed to, and nobody told him to leave, so he stayed. Ashby opened a folder. Ms. Voss, let's start with how you became aware of Project Carver. The county land survey record from 1963, Lena said. I described this to... I know what you described to Sheriff Cole. I'd like to hear it in full, in sequence now. She didn't say it unkindly. She said it the way a surgeon says this will be uncomfortable, informational, not apologetic. Lena walked through it. The land survey, the pulled thread, the 4 months of solo surveillance, the cam footage, the pattern recognition, the ground-penetrating radar sighting, the weeks of documenting before she had enough to know what she was looking at. Ashby listened. She wrote occasionally, but not constantly, the kind of writer who takes notes to confirm rather than to record. Why didn't you come forward when you first identified the site? Reporting risk, Lena said. Any information I passed through open channels was a potential disclosure to exactly the people I was worried about. Bridgemore has shown they have contacts in several agencies. That's a judgment call that has significant implications, Ashby said. I know that. You're not currently operating in any official capacity. I know that too. So you made a unilateral decision to surveil a federal site containing Category 3 materials for 4 months rather than reporting through proper channels because you judged the reporting risk to be too high. Yes. Ashby looked at her. Walk me through your background. A pause. The first real pause Ethan had observed from Lena in an official context. Not uncertainty, the pause of someone deciding on a frame. Army, 8 years. I finished as a staff sergeant. Unit? 75th Ranger Regiment for 3 years. Then a 4-year attachment to a Joint Special Operations task element that I'm not going to designate specifically without DoD authorization. Ashby wrote something. What was the nature of your work in that task element? Long-range reconnaissance and precision engagement, with significant secondary work and site assessment, specifically the assessment of legacy military installations for material integrity and security risk. Lena looked at the table. Which is how I know what a Carver category site looks like when I'm standing outside one. Ashby put her pen down. You were assessing legacy sites. Yes, in an official capacity. For 4 years, until the unit was restructured and I was separated as part of that restructuring. A beat. Honorably, with full documentation. And then you moved to Silver Hollow. And then I moved to Silver Hollow. Ashby sat back. She looked at Lena for a moment with an expression that was hard to read. Not warmth, but something that was the professional equivalent of recognition. You recognized the site, and you had the training to assess it and the experience to understand the risk category. And you decided to handle it yourself because you didn't trust the reporting channels. I decided to surveil it until I had enough to make the report impossible to ignore or misplace, Lena said. There's a difference. There's that phrase again, Ethan said quietly. Both women looked at him. He held up a hand. Sorry. Ashby turned back to Lena. The 2 individuals on the logging road. Walk me through that. Lena walked through it. Clinical, sequential, nothing embellished. Entry onto her property. Weapons drawn toward an occupied structure. She'd been in position. She'd engaged. Distance to first target, Ashby said. 940 yards. Ashby wrote it down without commenting on it. But the act of not commenting on it was itself a comment. You've been maintaining your precision engagement skills. I shoot every day. 940 yards, winter mountain conditions, moving target. He wasn't moving at engagement, Lena said. He'd raised his weapon and taken a static stance. Still, Lena didn't respond. The second. 812. He was attempting to flank and set a firing position. I had approximately a 4-second window before he would have had a clear line on the cabin. Ashby was quiet for a moment. Ms. Voss, I'm going to ask you something directly, and I'd appreciate a direct answer. Okay. Tonight on the mountain, the engagement with the Bridgemore contractors. Walk me through what you did. Lena looked at her steadily. I disrupted their formation from the East Ridge, 2 shots, both designed to eliminate the immediate threat without lethal outcome. Ashby's pen stopped. Without lethal. The first shot disabled the primary shooter's ability to engage, shoulder, right side, broke the clavicle and the weapon arm at the joint. He's going to need surgery. She said this the way she said everything, even factual. The second was a similar result, left side. He was attempting to bring a secondary weapon into play. You made non-lethal precision shots at that distance. I made the shots that were appropriate to the situation, Lena said. The situation required stopping the threat. It didn't require killing anyone. Ashby looked at her for a long time. Ethan watched Ashby look at Lena and watched Lena sit under that look, with the same quality of stillness she'd had in everything. Not defiant, not performing, just present and certain about what she'd done and why. The woman, Kovac, Ashby said. You'd identified her before tonight. I identified her as a potential connection to the original project 4 weeks ago. I wasn't certain until I saw her move toward the western entrance tonight. A pause. Her father's documentation was what filled the gaps in the records I'd been able to access. She had the piece I was missing, which is how she got inside. Yes. And you let the convoy move in first because you knew they'd go to the secondary entrance. Because I knew they'd hit the wrong location and give me time to reposition and deal with Kovac when she made her move. Lena's voice was steady. I couldn't cover both positions simultaneously. I had to sequence it. I needed the convoy occupied and I needed Kovac to show her hand. Ashby turned a page in her folder. You orchestrated this. I managed it, Lena said. There's a difference. Another silence. Ashby closed her folder. She looked at Lena and then at the folder and then at Ethan and then back at Lena. I have a significant number of additional questions, she said, and I'd like you to remain available for the next 48 hours. I understand. Your firearm will remain in custody pending the completion of I know. And I need you to understand that the unilateral nature of your surveillance operation over the last 4 months is something that will require formal review. I understand that too, Lena said. I'd make the same choice again. Ashby looked at her. I believe you, she said, and there was something in it that was neither approval nor disapproval, but something that lived in the space between the two, where the people who did difficult, necessary things in imperfect ways generally lived. The debrief went on until nearly 4. When it finally ended, Ethan walked out into the pre-dawn cold of the Forest Service parking area and stood for a moment breathing air that tasted like pine resin and frozen ground and the faint diesel exhaust from the generator running inside. Holloway came out behind him. Then Petra. Then, after a few minutes, Lena. The 4 of them stood in the parking area in the dark and said nothing for a while. Then Holloway said, I owe some people phone calls in the morning, people I should have called a long time ago. Nobody responded to that. Petra pulled a thermos from her jacket and poured coffee into the cap and handed it to Lena, who took it and drank. Her hands, Ethan noticed for the first time, were slightly unsteady. The particular tremor that came not from cold or fear, but from sustained adrenaline metabolizing out of a system that had been running on it for hours. She held the cup with both hands. Nobody mentioned it. The sky to the east was beginning to consider whether it might eventually produce light, the black going to deep blue at the horizon, and somewhere above them the mountain sat with its emptied chambers and its 50-year secret finally hauled into the open, and Ethan thought about all the years that secret had been sitting there while people built their lives around it and told themselves they were doing fine. His radio crackled. Marlene's voice, Sheriff, we've got a situation. He looked at the radio. What now? A man named Harlan Cole, no relation, is here at the office claiming he's a federal oversight agent and demanding access to the incident report. He's... A pause that had Marlene's specific flavor of controlled exasperation. He's been on the phone with someone for the last 20 minutes, and he keeps saying the phrase administrative jurisdiction like it's going to do something. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. He also, Marlene continued, brought a man named Garrett Walsh, who apparently is from the DOD Office of Paper Shuffling, Legacy Material Compliance, and Mr. Walsh has a document that claims the materials recovered tonight fall under a federal proprietary designation that supersedes local law enforcement documentation rights. And he wants everything up, cameras, notes, the works, turned over by 6 a.m. Ethan looked at Lena. She was looking at the eastern sky. Voss? He said. She turned. Did you know there was a DOD Legacy Material Compliance Office? She was quiet for a moment. Yes. Did you know they might show up tonight? Another pause, slightly longer. I considered it a possibility. Is that why you gave Ashby's team the classification 6 weeks ago? The contingency you mentioned? Lena looked at the coffee in her hands. If the right federal mechanism is already active and documented before the compliance office arrives, they don't have grounds to pull jurisdiction. She paused. The compliance office exists primarily to protect old institutional decisions from scrutiny. They're not bad people necessarily. They work to keep things quiet. And Ashby's team works to actually fix things. She drank the last of the coffee. There's a difference. Ethan raised the radio. Marlene, tell Mr. Cole and Mr. Walsh that the incident is already under active federal coordination through an emergency response protocol, and that any jurisdictional questions should be directed to the coordinating officer, whose contact information I'll send you in approximately 3 minutes. Copy, Marlene said. They're not going to like that. No, he agreed. They're not. He looked at Petra, who was already composing a text on her phone with the particular speed of someone who'd been anticipating this moment. She held the phone up without looking at him. The text was addressed to Ashby. Legacy compliance arriving at county office. 6 a.m. deadline claimed. You'll want to make a call. The reply came back in 40 seconds. On it. Petra pocketed her phone. She knew about them too, she said, to nobody specifically. Lena was looking at the eastern sky again. The blue was deepening at the horizon. Not light yet, but the suggestion of it. The mountain above them was beginning to separate from the sky in the way mountains do just before dawn, finding their edges again after the night had dissolved them. What happens now? Holloway said. He was asking generally, Ethan thought. Not a tactical question. Nobody answered immediately. The compliance office gets redirected, Lena said eventually. The materials get properly secured and neutralized. Kovac gets processed. She'll have information about the buyer network that's worth a significant amount to the right investigators. A pause. Bridgemore gets dismantled. That'll take time. 6 months, maybe a year. But the evidentiary trail from tonight is solid. And you? Holloway said. He was looking at her directly. Not the evaluating look of the veterans' dinner, not the uncertain look of the diner. Something else. Something that had come from standing on a frozen mountain in the dark and holding an entrance because someone who'd had every reason not to trust him had trusted him anyway. Lena looked at the horizon. I don't know yet, she said. You could stay, he said. Silver Hollow. I burned my cabin down, she said. Not literally, but her cameras were gone, her equipment was gone, her files were taken or destroyed. The place that had been her operational base for 8 months was stripped. You could rebuild, he said. Lena was quiet. Ethan watched her look at the mountain. He thought about the woman who'd walked into a veterans' dinner and stood at the back with a cup of coffee while a man explained why she couldn't be what she so clearly was, and who had set her cup in the trash and walked out without saying anything, because she didn't need to say anything. He thought about 940 yards. He thought about without lethal outcome. He thought about the thumb drive on top of the red hard drive, and the chain of custody starting with you, and the 6 weeks of contingency building that nobody had known about until it became the thing that protected the whole operation. The sky was definitely lighter now, not dawn yet, just the pre-dawn that promised it. His radio crackled again. Marlene. Sheriff, the compliance guys are asking if you're coming in. Tell them I'm on my way, he said. He looked at the group of them, Holloway with his bruised forearm and 50 years of debt he'd just started paying, Petra, leaning against the Forest Service building with her thermos and her duffel and her complete indifference to what anyone thought about her being there. Lena, watching the mountain with the same stillness she'd had on the first morning, the same gray-green eyes that didn't give anything away that she hadn't decided to give. I'll see you in a few hours, he said to no one specifically. Yeah, Lena said. He got in his truck and drove down the mountain toward the town where people were starting to wake up without knowing that the world they were waking up in was slightly different from the one they'd gone to sleep in, and he thought that maybe that was how most of the important changes happened. Quietly, on cold mountains, in the dark, by people nobody had bothered to look at carefully until it was almost too late. The sun came over the ridge behind him as he hit the valley road. It lit up the mountain gold, briefly, before the clouds moved in. The compliance officers left Silver Hollow at 9:17 a.m. without what they'd come for. Ethan watched them go from the window of his office, two dark sedans pulling out of the parking lot in the gray morning light, moving with the particular energy of men who had been outmaneuvered and knew it, and were already composing their explanations for whoever they reported to. Harlan Cole had spent 40 minutes trying variations of the phrase administrative jurisdiction, and Garrett Walsh had presented his DOD document 3 separate times, as if repetition might change its legal weight, and then Ashby's people had made a phone call from the hallway that Ethan hadn't been able to hear, but whose effects had been immediate and final. Walsh had folded the document back into his briefcase with the careful movements of a man managing his own dignity. "This isn't resolved," he'd said. "It's resolved for today," Ashby had said pleasantly. "Have a safe drive." Marlene set a cup of coffee on Ethan's desk. "You should sleep." "I know. You've been awake for—" "I know, Marlene." She went back to her desk. He drank the coffee and looked at the parking lot and thought about everything that was still in motion. The criminal processing, the material transport, the Bridgemore investigation that was already being coordinated out of an office he'd never heard of a week ago. Kovac was in federal custody. The 2 contractors Lena had shot were in a hospital in Billings, both in stable condition, both facing federal charges that would follow them for the rest of their lives. The 5 others had been processed and transferred overnight. The man Holloway had stopped at the primary entrance, the one with the knife, had a name that turned out to be Leonard Vane, and Leonard Vane had a history in 3 countries that made his involvement in this operation make complete sense to everyone who read his file, which Ethan was not cleared to see in full, but which Tesler had summarized for him in 4 words. He won't make bail. The case that Holloway had carried down from the mountain was in a secure federal facility by 6 a.m. The 4 remaining containers in the 3rd chamber had been removed and transported under the response team's protocol before 7. By the time the Silver Hollow sun had fully cleared the ridge, the mountain was just a mountain again, at least from the outside. What it would take to properly document, review, and archive what had been in that chamber was, according to Ashby, a matter of months rather than weeks. What it would take to trace the full network of buyers, intermediaries, and institutional failures that had allowed Carver to sit undiscovered and unsecured for 50 years was longer than that. What it would take for the people of Silver Hollow to understand what had happened above their town on a January night was something else entirely. Well, the community meeting happened 12 days later. It wasn't officially a community meeting. It was a county public safety briefing organized by Ethan's office and attended by Tesler and a federal communications liaison named Drummond, who had been specifically selected for his ability to explain complex situations in clear, non-alarming language. About 120 people showed up, which for Silver Hollow in January was essentially everyone. The briefing covered what could be disclosed. An illegal extraction operation had been interdicted on federal land adjacent to the town. Criminal actors had been apprehended. Hazardous materials had been identified and properly secured by federal specialists. There was no ongoing threat to the community. Additional information would be made available as the federal investigation allowed. Drummond was smooth and thorough and answered questions with the practiced ease of a man who'd spent years telling people enough truth to satisfy them without telling them all of it. Then Grant Holloway stood up. He was in the 4th row, wearing a plain flannel shirt and no decorations, which for Grant Holloway, at a public event in Silver Hollow, was a statement in itself. He stood, and he waited until Drummond acknowledged him, and then he didn't address Drummond at all. He turned and faced the room. "I have something to say," he said. "It's not related to the federal briefing. It's personal." The room shifted. 120 people adjusting in folding chairs. 50 years ago, I was part of an operation that I should have reported and didn't. I made that decision for reasons that seemed reasonable at the time and that I've spent a long time not examining too closely. What happened on that mountain 2 weeks ago is a direct consequence of that decision." He paused. He was not comfortable. Ethan could see. This was not the ease of the veteran's dinner speech, the polished delivery of a man on home ground. This was someone saying something difficult in public because the alternative was continuing to not say it. "I wanted this community to hear that from me directly. I was wrong. My silence had cost. And I'm sorry for it." The room was quiet. Someone in the back asked, "What happened up there, exactly? Who stopped it?" Holloway looked at Ethan, who was standing along the wall. Ethan looked back at him. "A woman named Lena Voss," Holloway said, "who has been living on this mountain for 8 months, and who some of you, and I include myself very specifically in this, didn't take seriously." Another silence. "She's not here tonight?" someone asked. "No," Holloway said. "She's not." Lena had been gone for 9 days when the meeting happened. She'd left Silver Hollow 3 days after the mountain. Not dramatically. She'd come by the sheriff's office in the late afternoon, driven a truck she'd apparently borrowed from Petra, and sat across from Ethan's desk with a cup of the terrible office coffee and told him she was leaving. "Where?" he'd asked. "I don't know yet." She looked at the coffee. "Ashby's team has a standing offer, a formal position, properly documented, doing the kind of assessment work I've been doing informally." A pause. "She wants me to consider it." "Will you?" "I'm considering it." She turned the cup in her hands. That slight tremor was still there, he noticed, fainter now, but not entirely gone. Maybe it was always there and he was only now looking for it. "I don't know if I'm ready to be inside an institution again. I came here to be outside of them." "How'd that work out?" She gave him a look that was entirely flat, and then something shifted at the corner of her mouth. "Not as planned." "The cabin? I'll deal with the cabin." A pause. "Eventually." He looked at her across the desk. In the flat fluorescent light of a county sheriff's office, she looked exactly like what she was. Tired, a little hollowed out, not quite finished processing whatever the mountain had cost her. Not the composed mystery of the first morning. Something more human than that, and more compelling for it. "Holloway's been asking about you, he said. "I know." He texted. "Did you respond?" "I told him thank you for holding the entrance." She looked at the window. "That's true, and it's enough for now." "He's going to testify," Ethan said, voluntarily, about 1973. The formal review that Ashby's office is running, he's already contacted their people and offered a full statement. Lena was quiet for a moment. "Good," she said, and then more quietly, "Good." She stood up and set the cup on his desk. She picked up her jacket from the chair back and put it on, unhurried, and when she was done, she looked at him. "You did the right things," she said. "Every time it mattered, you did the right thing." "I went to the vehicle when you told me not to engage." "You went to the vehicle," she agreed. "I said don't go inside. You didn't go inside." The corner of her mouth moved again. "There's a difference." He stood up. They shook hands across the desk, which was formal and slightly awkward, and also exactly right for what they were to each other. Two people who had spent 3 days on the edge of something serious and come through it without pretending it was more than it was. "If Ashby offers you the position," he said, "take it." She looked at him. "You spent 8 months alone on a mountain trying to fix something by yourself," he said. "You almost did it. Almost. You needed Holloway's local knowledge and Petra's west coverage, and me going to the vehicle." He paused. "You're better with people than you think you are, or than you let yourself be." Lena stood at the door of his office for a moment. She didn't argue with it, and she didn't agree with it. She walked out, and he heard the outer door of the office open and close, and that was the last he saw of her. For a while. The federal review of Project Carver formally concluded 4.5 months later. The findings were, in the language of the official summary that Ethan received as a cooperating law enforcement official, significant and wide-ranging. The improper disposal of Category 3 materials at the Silver Hollow site had been documented and assigned to decisions made by a project manager, designated in the report as W. Steele, with the knowing silence of multiple supporting personnel. The subsequent 50-year failure of oversight was traced through a series of bureaucratic transitions and deliberate record management that the report described, in the careful language of official documents trying not to name things too directly, as representing a systematic institutional failure. Bridgemore Consulting Group was dissolved by federal order. Its registered director, a man named Paul Ashford, was indicted on 11 counts including trafficking in restricted materials, conspiracy, and the deaths of 2 men on a Montana mountain. He went to trial 8 months later. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Nadia Kovac cooperated with federal investigators. Her cooperation produced significant intelligence about the buyer network her father had spent 30 years building, a network that, it turned out, included individuals in 4 countries and had been actively operational for longer than anyone had realized. In exchange for her cooperation, her charges were reduced. She received a sentence of 7 years, with eligibility for review after 5. Whether that was justice or pragmatism or some specific proportion of both was a question that Ethan turned over occasionally and never fully settled. Leonard Vane was convicted on federal charges and sentenced to 22 years without parole. The contractors who had been shot on the mountain recovered fully. They were tried together and convicted together and received sentences ranging from 4 to 9 years depending on their specific roles and the degree of their cooperation with investigators. Holloway gave his formal statement to Ashby's review panel in March. He sat for 6 hours across a table from 3 investigators and told them everything he remembered about 1973 and everything he'd heard in the years since and everything he'd chosen not to do with either. The panel's final notes, which Ethan was shown a portion of, described him as a cooperative witness whose voluntary testimony was materially significant to the completeness of the review's findings. He was not charged with anything. Whether he should have been was a question that the review panel apparently considered and decided against on the grounds that his actions in January had been determinative in preventing a significant harm, and that the value of voluntary disclosure outweighed the marginal legal accountability that could have been pursued. Ethan didn't know how he felt about that. He suspected Holloway didn't entirely either. What Holloway did, in the months after, was quieter than anything he'd done publicly in Silver Hollow before. He stepped back from the city council. He stepped back from the volunteer boards. He showed up at the Veterans Dinner in November and sat in the audience instead of on the dais, and when someone tried to call him up to speak, he shook his head and stayed in his seat and listened. He also started writing letters. Ethan knew this because Holloway told him, one afternoon in the diner over coffee, that was marginally better than the office kind. Letters to people he'd served with, letters to the families of people who were gone, letters that said what he should have said, in some cases 30 years ago, and in some cases much sooner than that. "She told me something," Holloway said. "Voss, when she said, 'Thank you for the entrance.'" He looked at his cup. She said, "That's enough for now. Not that's enough. For now." He paused. "I've been thinking about what that means." Ethan looked at him. "I think it means the accounting isn't finished," Holloway said. "It just moved to a different form." Ethan thought that was probably right. But Ashby's formal offer to Lena came through official channels in February, which was 3 weeks after Lena had already informally accepted it in a conversation Ethan learned about secondhand from Petra, who mentioned it with the particular brevity of someone who considered the outcome obvious. She held out for full documentation, Petra said. Her previous unit attachment, her separation circumstances, the nature of her work, all of it on record. They agreed? They agreed. Petra poured herself coffee from the thermos she apparently carried everywhere. She also negotiated the ability to take individual assessment contracts rather than a permanent post. She didn't want to be in an office. Naturally. She'll be in the field, mostly. Petra looked at the cup. Better than a mountain alone. Is it? Petra considered it. For her, yeah. She needs the problem to work. She just also needs to not be entirely by herself when she's working it. A pause. She knows that now. I think she knew it before. She just hadn't said it out loud. Ethan thought about the debrief. I managed it. There's a difference. He thought about 940 yards and non-lethal outcome, and the thumb drive on top of the red hard drive, and the contingency filed 6 weeks before anyone else knew a contingency was needed. He thought about a woman standing at the back of a veteran's dinner with a paper cup of coffee, listening to a decorated man explain why she couldn't be what she so demonstrably was, and saying nothing and setting her cup in the trash and walking out into the January cold. She'd known. She'd known the whole time, not with arrogance, with the particular quietness of someone who'd stopped needing the room to know what she knew. He'd wondered sometimes, in the months after, what that felt like, to carry something like that in silence, whether it was freeing or whether it was a kind of loneliness that had its own specific weight. He thought probably it was both. She came back to Silver Hollow in May. Not permanently. She came back for a week, driving the same kind of truck she'd borrowed from Petra the day she left. And she stayed at the motel on Route 9 because the cabin was still in the state the break-in had left it. And on the second day, she drove up the logging road to look at it. Ethan drove up after her. He wasn't sure why, exactly. He didn't have official business there. He just drove up. She was standing outside the cabin when he arrived, hands in her jacket pockets, looking at the structure with the focused assessment of someone taking inventory. The north window had been boarded over with plywood that had weathered gray over the winter. The satellite dish was still mounted but listing slightly, ice damage probably. The firewood stack had been disturbed and then partially restacked by someone, or by weather, or by both. "It's fixable," he said. "I know." She looked at the roof. "The metal took the winters fine, the structure's sound." "Are you going to fix it?" She was quiet for a moment. The May sun was strong up on the ridge, the snow mostly gone from the south-facing slopes and still deep in the north shadows, and the air had that particular quality of a Montana spring that felt like a promise nobody was quite ready to believe yet. "I don't know," she said. "Maybe. Ashby's field work will take you other places." "Yes?" "So the cabin would be a place to come back to." She looked at him. "I've never had one of those. A place that's specifically for coming back to." A pause. "I moved here to disappear, but I think if I fixed it, I'd be keeping it for a different reason." He stood next to her and looked at the cabin. It was modest and functional and had the bones of something that could be good again with work, and it sat on its shelf of rock with a view down the valley that on a clear day went for 40 miles. "The town knows what you did," he said. "I know." Holloway told them. "He texted me about the meeting." A pause. "I appreciated that he told them. I don't need them to know, but I appreciate that he told them." "There's a difference," Ethan said. She looked at him sideways. "There's a difference," she agreed. Below them in the valley, Silver Hollow was small and ordinary and going about its morning. The diner opening, the school buses running, the gas station at the corner of Main and Route 9, where someone was always stopped for coffee. A town that had spent 50 years living under a mountain that kept its secrets, and that was still standing, and that would continue standing now that the secrets had been taken out and dealt with. "Petra wants to come up in the summer," Lena said. She mentioned hiking. "Petra hikes?" "Apparently." Something in her voice. "I think she wants to check on me." "Does that bother you?" A pause. Longer than most of her pauses. "No," she said. "I don't think it does." She looked at the cabin again, at the boarded window and the listing dish and the firewood stack that needed restacking, all the work that needed doing. "I'll be back in August," she said. "Between contracts. I'll start on the window." "I know someone who does good work," Ethan said. "Reasonable rates. I don't need help." "I didn't say you needed it." He looked at her. "I said I know someone." Lena stood on the ridge in the May morning and didn't answer immediately. The wind came up from the valley and moved her hair, and she put her hand up to push it back, an ordinary human gesture that for some reason landed on Ethan as the most real thing he'd seen in months. "Okay," she said finally. "Just that." "Okay." She looked at the mountain above the cabin, the high rock faces, the dark timber, The ridgeline where she'd lain in January cold for hours, doing something that most people couldn't do in ideal conditions. She looked at it without drama or sentiment, the way you look at a place that has cost you something and given you something in roughly equal measure, and that you're not done with yet. Then she turned and walked back to her truck. Ethan stood at the cabin and watched her go. He watched the truck move down the logging road until it disappeared into the trees, and then he stood for another minute in the spring sun on the ridge above the valley where he'd chosen to make his life, in a place that had turned out to be less quiet than advertised and more worth staying in for it. He thought about what Holloway had said in the diner. The accounting isn't finished, it just moved to a different form. He thought about Lena coming back in August, about a boarded window and a listing dish and a firewood stack that needed work. About a woman who had come to a mountain to disappear and had ended up being impossible to overlook, not because she'd sought it, but because she was exactly what she was, consistently, in the dark and in the cold and under pressure and alone, and eventually reality had simply caught up to what she'd been the whole time. He drove back down the mountain to the town that was his to look after. Below him in the valley, the day was fully underway, ordinary and continuing. The mountain above it stood the same as it always had, holding nothing anymore that shouldn't be there. Some people spend a lifetime being exactly what they are, in silence, in the dark, with no one watching. They don't do it for the recognition, they do it because it's what they're made of, and because the moment will eventually come when it matters. And when that moment arrives, they are simply, completely, already there.